Chapter 1. The Unlikely Accusation. Sergeant Jack Talbot had never known silence quite like this before. After hours of fighting, the brutal firefights, the explosions, the endless barrage of gunfire, all of it had suddenly stopped. It was as if the universe itself had held its breath, freezing the world around him. Jack lay sprawled on his back, the dry dust of an unknown world clinging to his combat suit. His eyes stared up at the sky, the stars distant pinpricks of light scattered across the vast expanse, offering no comfort or answers. His body ached from the battle, his muscles sore from the relentless fight he'd been caught in just hours earlier. His squad was nowhere to be found, and the only sounds that met his ears were the faint rustling of alien plants and the occasional thud of distant machinery. He felt completely alone, isolated in a landscape that seemed both eerily beautiful and hauntingly foreign. The world around him was unlike any other he had set foot on in his military career. The gravity was different, heavier in some places and lighter in others. The air had a strange, metallic taste to it, and the atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the planet itself were watching him. Jack could feel his pulse pounding in his temples as he lay there, trying to steady his breathing. His helmet was cracked, the comms were down, and his squad was scattered. He hadn't heard from any of them in hours. The alien forces had launched a surprise assault, attacking the Terran outpost with such precision that the human defenders had barely put up a fight. The Zollan ancient, war-hardened species from a distant star system had come from nowhere, their ships appearing without warning, overwhelming the defenses of humanity's forward military positions. Jack's squad had been one of the first to be caught in the crossfire. They had fought bravely, of course. They had held their ground for as long as they could, pushing back against the alien onslaught. But in the end, it had been futile. The Zal were too well organized, too advanced. Jack had watched in disbelief as their armored infantry stormed over the human defenses, cutting through their lines with deadly precision. His team had been split apart in the chaos, and Jack had barely managed to escape with his life. Now, here he was, stranded on an alien world, wounded and disoriented, with no idea what was happening back at the front lines. He had no way of knowing if his squadmates were dead or alive. The last thing he had heard on his comms before they went silent was a panicked shout from Corporal Hightower, followed by a burst of static. Since then, everything had gone dark. Jack struggled to his feet, his body protesting with every movement. He had to find shelter, get somewhere he could regroup, and try to get a signal out. He fumbled with the controls on his wristband, trying to restore his connection, but nothing worked. His suit's display flickered, the vital stats slowly ticking down, a reminder of how long he had been out here with no supplies. It wasn't a matter of if he would die, it was a matter of when. The harsh environment, the lack of food or water, and the relentless search for his squad were all compounding the pressure on him. He started to move, pushing forward through the terrain, stumbling across rocks and uneven ground. The distant hum of unknown alien creatures drifting through the air like ghostly whispers. There were no sounds of battle now, no skirmishes between the two sides. The war seemed to have paused, frozen in time as the silence washed over the land. For a brief moment, Jack let himself hope that perhaps the alien forces had pulled back, that maybe there was a chance to regroup, to fight again. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Zal had never retreated, not in all the wars humanity had fought with them. They were relentless, unstoppable, and Jack was just another piece in their war machine, something to be discarded when no longer of use. The hours passed, and Jack's weariness began to catch up with him. His legs felt like lead, his vision blurred from dehydration. The alien world seemed to close in around him, its strange beauty only adding to the isolation he felt. There was nothing left. No hope of rescue, no way to communicate. Only the endless expanse of an alien landscape stretching out before him, like a massive, hostile wilderness. He had always been a fighter, always willing to press on no matter the odds, but this felt different. The weight of the situation was crushing him, and for the first time in his life, Jack felt small. He felt insignificant. As the last slivers of daylight faded, Jack found himself stumbling into a small ravine, a deep cut in the land that seemed to offer some semblance of shelter from the relentless winds. He collapsed against the jagged stone wall, his breath coming in short gasps. The only sound now was the faint thrum of his suit's emergency systems, the slow beep of the heart monitor, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. It was then that he heard something else. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the sound of a ship's engines humming far off in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Was someone coming for him? Jack's pulse quickened. He stumbled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his side, and staggered toward the sound. His legs were unsteady, but he pushed on, desperate to find any sign of life, any hope of salvation. The hum grew louder as he moved, until he could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath him. It was real. There was someone out there. Maybe a rescue team, maybe a Zol patrol, but at this point, it didn't matter. He just needed to know he wasn't alone. He crested a small rise in the ravine, and what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. A massive ship, unlike anything he had ever seen before, was hovering above the ravine, its dark silhouette blocking out the stars. The ship was smooth, sleek, with an elegant, almost organic design, as though it had grown from the very land itself. It glided silently through the air, a perfect blend of advanced technology and alien aesthetics. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Jack felt a wave of panic rise in his chest as the ship descended slowly, its engines making no sound as it hovered just above the ground. The landing gear deployed with a hiss, and the ship settled onto the ravine floor. The air around Jack grew tense with the weight of what was happening. Who were these people? What did they want? The hatch of the ship opened, and from it stepped a figure. It was tall, humanoid, but undeniably alien. The being wore a sleek suit of dark armor, its face hidden behind a glowing visor. As the figure moved forward, several more emerged from the ship, each of them dressed in similar armor, their movements precise and coordinated. They were not soldiers, at least, not in the way Jack had seen in the human military, but they were disciplined, trained. These were beings who were used to war, used to making decisions that were beyond the scope of ordinary life. The figure who led them stepped closer to Jack, their helmeted face regarding him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Jack instinctively reached for his weapon, but it was too late. The aliens were faster, their movements fluid and coordinated. One of them reached out and effortlessly disarmed him. His sidearm clattered to the ground, useless. Jack's heart raced in his chest as he backed up, trying to make sense of the situation. But the aliens' presence was overwhelming. They weren't just here to capture him. They were here for something else, something far more terrifying. The leader of the alien group tilted their head, their visor glowing in the dim light of the planet. "Human soldier," the voice came, muffled through their helmet. "You have been found guilty of your species' aggression, and now, you will face your punishment." Jack's mind raced. What punishment? Was this some kind of interrogation? Had the Zal captured him and sent him to a tribunal for judgment? "You will undergo the trial of bonding," the alien leader continued, their voice calm, yet with an unsettling authority. "It is the only sentence for one of your kind who has entered our territory with the intent of war. You will be judged, not by death or imprisonment, but by a different method. You will face our women." Jack's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "I'm a soldier. I'm just Dash." "You are not just a soldier," the leader interrupted, stepping forward with a deliberate pace. "You are a symbol of the aggression of your people. To face true judgment, you will experience the trial, a mating ritual that will bond you to our women. If you survive the bonding, you will be freed. If not, you will cease to be." Jack's heart stopped as he processed the words. Mating ritual? What in the hell was happening? Before he could respond, the aliens moved with swift efficiency. They bound his arms and legs, and the leader gestured to the ship behind them. "You will face your judgment," the leader said again, their voice cold. "Prepare yourself for the trial." As Jack was led toward the ship, his mind was a blur of confusion and fear. What had he gotten himself into? How could this be happening? He was a soldier, a fighter, not some participant in an alien ritual. But the aliens were insistent, and their grip was ironclad. He had no choice but to follow them, toward a fate he couldn't begin to understand. Chapter 2. The Trial of Bonding. The door to the alien ship closed behind him with a soft hiss, and Jack was ushered into a large, open chamber. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of unfamiliar incense, the lighting dim and warm, as though the room had been designed to create a sense of intimacy, something Jack couldn't wrap his mind around. His pulse raced as the air around him seemed to tighten. The trial, whatever it was, had begun. "You are here to undergo the trial of bonding," the leader spoke again, their voice devoid of emotion. "This is not a choice you made. This is the sentence for your kind. You will participate or face death." Jack stood in the center of the room, his arms bound, his legs still unsteady from the strain of the last few hours. He tried to process what was happening, but nothing made sense. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the walls lined with alien symbols, the strange apparatuses scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the ship's interior that drew his attention. It was the women who had entered the room behind him. They were tall, statuesque, their features both alien and undeniably feminine. They wore simple garments that barely concealed the power in their physique. Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of their gaze as they sized him up, their eyes glowing faintly with an intensity he couldn't fathom. They were not just any aliens, they were the decision-makers, the judges of the ritual. And now, he was to be a part of it. "You will mate with them, and in doing so, you will face your punishment," the leader continued. "If you survive, your people's aggression may be forgiven. If not, your body will serve as a lesson to those who come after you." Jack's mind was spinning. This was no tribunal. This was no trial. This was something far more primal, and he had no control over it. Jack's breath quickened as the weight of the situation settled on him. There was no escaping now, no room for negotiation. The alien women, tall and poised, encircled him slowly. Their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as though they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. He wasn't just an intruder in their space anymore. He was the subject of something much darker, much more profound. Their eyes locked on his every movement, as though evaluating him not as a soldier, but as a vessel, a means to an end that he could not yet comprehend. His heart pounded in his chest, the steady rhythm echoing in his ears as he tried to make sense of the alien ritual that had been thrust upon him. These women were not soldiers, not warriors like the ones he was used to fighting. There was an undeniable power in their presence, an energy that radiated from them, and it was clear that they were in control, not just of the room, but of the very situation. Jack's mind raced as he tried to push back the rising panic. He had fought battles, faced death countless times, but this was unlike anything he had ever encountered. This wasn't war. This was something else entirely. The leader of the group, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Jack's. "You may resist, human," she said, her voice echoing with an unsettling calmness. "But know this, resistance will only delay the inevitable. Your people have brought war to our lands. Now, you will pay for that with your body, with your spirit. The trial of bonding is not a punishment, it is a cleansing. If you survive, you will be free. If you do not, you will serve as a reminder to your species of the consequences of their actions." Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind clouded with confusion. A cleansing? What kind of ritual was this? His mind screamed for him to fight back, to somehow make sense of the overwhelming force that was surrounding him. But even as the words formed in his mind, his body betrayed him. The fear was too much, the confusion too deep. He had no idea what was going to happen next. Was he to become some sort of sacrifice? Was he to be a pawn in an ancient tradition that had no place in his world? He could only wait, unable to act, as the women closed in on him. The leader raised a hand, and with that simple gesture, the other women stepped closer. Jack instinctively recoiled, but the restraints on his arms and legs held him firm. He was trapped, caught in their gaze, their control, and there was nothing he could do but wait for the inevitable. Their presence was suffocating, each one of them radiating a power that he had no way of understanding. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, judging, and it was clear that whatever this ritual was, it was as much about testing him as it was about condemning him. Without a word, the women began to remove their simple garments, each movement deliberate, graceful, and unerringly synchronized. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing heavier, as if the very air thickened with the tension of what was about to unfold. Jack's mind was reeling, his instinct screaming at him to break free, to fight back. But there was nowhere to go. His body was frozen, unable to act, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with unbearable force. "Don't fight it," the leader said, her voice still calm, as though she were speaking to a child rather than a soldier. Let the ritual take its course. It is the only way for you to understand our people, to understand the price of war. The room seemed to close in around him, the alien women now standing in front of him, their presence overwhelming. Jack could feel the power emanating from them, but it wasn't just physical. It was a power of intent, of purpose, and for the first time, Jack realized how utterly out of control he was in this situation. They had him, mind and body, and there was nothing he could do but endure. As the leader stepped forward, her hand lightly grazing his chest, Jack's mind exploded with questions. Why? Why had this happened to him? What kind of beings were these? They were not like any aliens he had encountered in his military career. They were beyond anything he could understand, ancient, intelligent, powerful, and utterly alien. You will experience what your kind has wrought, the leader whispered. Only then will you be judged. Only then will you understand. And with those words, the world seemed to collapse around him. Chapter 3. The trial begins. The moment the leader touched his chest, Jack felt something strange, tingling sensation that spread through his entire body. It wasn't physical pain, but something deeper, something that reached into the core of him, into his very thoughts. The women around him stood perfectly still, their eyes never leaving him. Jack's chest tightened, and he tried to move, to break free, but the bonds held him fast. The sensation intensified, moving from his chest down to his limbs, and suddenly, he felt as if he were no longer alone in his own body. His mind was flooded with visions, images of other worlds, of distant stars and strange civilizations. He saw the faces of people who weren't human, beings of other species, their forms both alien and familiar in ways he couldn't explain. These were the Zal, and the memories they had shared with him were not his own. They were theirs. He was seeing the world through their eyes, feeling their emotions, their rage, their sorrow, their pain. He was experiencing their history, their war, their unending struggle for survival. Jack gasped, his breath shallow and ragged, as the visions continued to assault him. He saw entire planets torn apart, cities crumbling to dust, people screaming in the streets as their homes were destroyed. He saw the soldiers, the Zal warriors marching across their lands, their faces filled with resolve, knowing that their survival depended on the destruction of others. He saw the first battle, the first bloodshed, and he felt the weight of it all, the burden of centuries of war, of endless conflict that had shaped these people into what they were now. The visions stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving Jack gasping for air, his body trembling from the intensity of what he had just witnessed. The women around him remained still, silent, as though they had been waiting for this moment to pass. And Jack understood. This was not just a ritual of the body. This was a ritual of the mind, a trial to test whether he could withstand the weight of the alien people's history, a trial to determine if he was worthy of survival, or if he would become just another casualty of their endless war. The leader stepped forward again, her eyes gleaming with an emotion Jack couldn't place. "You have seen our history, our pain," she said softly, her voice almost tender. "Now, you will face the final part of the trial. You will join with us, and through this union, you will feel the bond we share, the bond of war, of survival, and of the price we pay." Jack's mind was reeling, the weight of everything he had just experienced crashing down on him. He had always thought of war in terms of combat, of strategy, of victories and losses. But this was different. This was more than just a fight between two species. This was something far more primal, something that went beyond war and into the core of what it meant to survive, to fight, and to live with the consequences of that struggle. He looked at the leader, his chest heaving with emotion, his mind still trying to process the images that had filled it. There was no more room for denial, no more room for pride. He had been judged not by his actions, but by the actions of his species, the legacy of humanity's aggression, and the unspoken cost of the war they had waged. He stood there, his body still held captive by the restraints, but his mind now free, understanding the gravity of the ritual he was about to undergo. This was not just punishment. This was a chance for redemption, for understanding, and for connection. The leader's gaze softened, a hint of something almost like pity crossing her features. "Now, you will join us," she said, her voice gentle but commanding. "You will bond with our women, and in doing so, You will understand the truth of what it means to survive, to fight, and to live in the shadow of war." Jack closed his eyes, his heart racing, as the women stepped closer, their eyes full of purpose and power. This was the trial. This was the price of war. And now, he had no choice but to face it. The air in the chamber felt thick with anticipation, the silence hanging between them like a heavy weight. Jack stood frozen in place, his mind still reeling from the vision of the Zal's war-torn past. He had seen it, felt it, the weight of centuries of conflict, loss, and survival. What was supposed to be a punishment, a ritual he could never have imagined, had turned into something much deeper. The visions had not just shown him their pain. They had offered him a window into their very existence, a glimpse into their souls. The weight of their suffering had been almost unbearable, and yet, in that moment, Jack understood that this wasn't just about him. It wasn't about his own survival or his punishment. It was about understanding the cost of war, the toll it took on everyone involved. The leader of the alien women, her imposing presence still radiating power, stepped closer to him. Her helmet remained on, but her eyes, those glowing, enigmatic eyes, were fixed on his. Jack could feel the intensity of her gaze, as though she was searching him, probing the depths of his being. She had spoken of the trial of bonding, but Jack now realized it was so much more than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about mating or surviving a ritual. It was about joining their world, their history, their endless struggle. The trial was a test of his humanity, of whether he could connect with them on a level beyond conflict and war. "You've seen our past," the leader spoke, her voice deep and steady. "Now you must understand our future. You will bond with our women, share in the connection that sustains us. If you survive this, you will become part of our world. And in return, we will offer you a new beginning. But only if you are strong enough." Jack's chest tightened at her words. The weight of the trial hadn't hit him fully until now. It wasn't just about physical endurance. It wasn't just about what he could survive. It was about his mind, his spirit, and whether he could bear the burden of understanding this alien species. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a participant in their history, their struggle for survival. He had been judged, and now he had to face the consequences, the ultimate test of his humanity. He had to prove he was worthy, not just of freedom, but of being part of something greater than himself. The women stepped forward, and Jack's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He knew that resistance was futile. They had already proven their control over him. His arms were still bound, his body immobile, but the weight of the situation, the gravity of what was happening, hit him with an undeniable force. He could feel the coolness of their touch as they moved closer to him, each one of them radiating an aura of power and grace. They were not just alien beings. They were embodiments of their people's struggles, of everything they had fought for. One of the women reached forward, her hand gentle but firm on his chest. The contact sent a shiver through him, and for the first time, Jack was acutely aware of how completely out of his depth he was. There was no going back now. His mind screamed for him to fight, to resist, but his body, his instincts knew that he had no choice but to endure. The trial had begun, and there was no escape from it. The leader stepped closer, her presence commanding yet somehow soothing. "You are at a crossroads, human," she said, her voice low, almost tender. "This is your final test. You must surrender to it. Only then will you truly understand the depths of our sacrifice, our way of life." Jack's heart raced as the realization washed over him. This wasn't just about a physical bond, it was about an understanding, a shared experience. To survive this trial, he would have to break down the walls between them, between himself and these aliens. He would have to connect with them on a level he had never connected with anyone before. And in doing so, he might just understand the cost of war, of survival, in ways he never could have imagined. Chapter 4. The True Meaning of the Bond. The chamber had grown still, the weight of the trial pressing down on Jack as the leader stepped back, allowing the women to surround him. He had no idea how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? It didn't matter anymore. Time seemed irrelevant in this moment, as though the very concept had been suspended by the alien ritual that was unfolding around him. Jack's body felt heavy with uncertainty, his mind overwhelmed by the flood of emotions and sensations that had erupted within him. His pulse raced, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what was happening. Every fiber of his being screamed for answers, for some kind of understanding, but all he could do was stand there, powerless to change his fate. The alien women moved with graceful precision, each one of them a silent presence, their eyes focused on Jack with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. It was clear that they were not just participants in the trial, they were its orchestrators, its judges. And Jack, for all his strength, his training, was nothing more than a subject in their experiment. He had been thrust into this trial not as a soldier, not as a man, but as a vessel for their history, their pain, and their future. One of the women, her eyes glowing with an ethereal light, stepped closer to Jack. Her gaze never left his, her presence commanding, almost magnetic. Jack felt an unspoken power radiating from her, a connection that went beyond physical touch. This was something different, something deeper. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing against his cheek, sending a shiver down his spine. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a quiet intensity. "The bond is forming. It will connect us. You will become part of us, part of our people, our struggle, and we will know your pain, your past." Jack swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking into his soul. The trial wasn't just about survival, it was about understanding. Understanding the war, understanding the people who had fought it, and understanding the price of survival. Jack wasn't just here to endure. He was here to become part of something far greater than himself. He was here to connect, to bridge the gap between his species and theirs, to feel what they had felt, to experience the world through their eyes. The woman's touch became more insistent, as if urging Jack to surrender to the connection. The air around him grew thick, heavy with the energy of the ritual, and Jack could feel the bond growing stronger, pulling him into something he had never experienced before. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, a merging of minds and spirits. He could feel their history flowing into him, their experiences, their grief, their victories and losses. He could feel the weight of their past, the scars they had carried for so long, and it was overwhelming. For a moment, Jack was no longer aware of his own body. He was no longer a soldier, no longer a human trapped in an alien ritual. He was something else, something greater, something shared between them. He felt the struggles of the Zal, the pain of their existence, the endless battle they had fought to survive in a galaxy that seemed intent on crushing them. He felt their rage and their sorrow, their determination to protect their people at all costs. And in that moment, Jack understood. The woman's touch grew more intimate, and Jack could feel the bond strengthening, a pulse of energy that coursed through his veins, connecting him to them in ways words could not describe. He was no longer an outsider. He was one of them. The leader stepped forward again, her presence commanding the room. She stood tall, her eyes glowing with an inner light, as if the ritual had unlocked something deep within her. She regarded Jack with a quiet intensity, her gaze both assessing and compassionate. "You have proven yourself human," she said, her voice resonating in the still air. "You have felt our history, our pain. You have endured the trial, and now, you are bonded with us. You are one of us." Jack stood there, his mind and body still overwhelmed by the ritual, but there was no denying the truth of what the leader had said. He had been tested not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. He had faced the darkness of their past, had felt the weight of their struggles, and had emerged on the other side, forever changed. For the first time, Jack understood the true meaning of war. It wasn't just about victory or defeat. It wasn't just about the soldiers who fought and died. It was about the cost of survival, the cost of carrying on when everything else seemed lost. And Jack had learned that lesson, not through violence or tactics, but through the bond he had formed with these aliens, with their people. It was a bond that transcended species, that transcended war. "You are free," the leader said softly, her voice filled with a quiet power. "And you are no longer alone. You are one of us, and we will fight together, shoulder to shoulder, until the end." Jack nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking into his soul. He was no longer just a soldier, no longer just a human. He was part of something greater, something that would change the course of the galaxy, something that would redefine the meaning of survival, of war, and of peace. The trial had not only bonded them, it had united them, and together, they would face whatever came next. The ritual was over, But the real fight was just beginning. Jack stood motionless, still processing the overwhelming flood of sensations that had rocked his mind and body. The chamber, once filled with an eerie silence, now felt almost alive with the reverberation of the trial's completion. The leader, along with the others, stood in solemn respect, their glowing eyes piercing the dim light that filtered through the room. There was a weight to their gaze, a sense of finality that hung in the air. Jack's body, though still trembling with the aftereffects of the bond, felt heavier now, as though the ritual had irrevocably altered something deep inside him. The alien women, no longer simply participants in the trial, now seemed like something far more guardians, perhaps, of a truth that he had been blind to until now. Jack's understanding of the universe had been turned on its head, his role in the galactic conflict between humanity and the Zal now irrevocably changed. No longer was he just a soldier, fighting for his people, for a cause that seemed to grow ever more meaningless in the face of the truth he had just experienced. No longer was he merely an outsider. He had been invited into the heart of something far older, far deeper than anything humanity had ever known. The leader stepped closer, her presence more imposing than ever. But this time, there was no threat in her movements, only a quiet sense of purpose. She reached up to her helmet and slowly removed it, revealing her face for the first time. Jack's breath caught in his chest as he took in her features, alien, yes, but undeniably beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Her skin shimmered faintly under the low light, her sharp features softened by the glow of the room. Her eyes, bright and perceptive, locked onto his, and in that moment, Jack knew there was more to this connection than he could understand. She wasn't just a judge in this ritual. She was a guide, a leader, and someone who had borne the weight of her people's history for longer than Jack had even imagined. "You have endured what few humans ever will," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with something deeper than the cold command she had exhibited earlier. "You have felt the burden of our war. You have experienced the pain of our people, and now you are bound to us, not as a prisoner or a foreign enemy, but as an ally." Jack didn't know how to respond. The words stuck in his throat, tangled in the mess of emotions that churned within him. He had been thrust into this alien world, this ritual that had forced him to confront the very heart of war in a way he never could have imagined. What was left for him now? He had learned so much, perhaps more than he ever wanted to know, but at what cost? Was he meant to be part of their struggle now, as they had suggested? Was he meant to fight alongside them? Or had the bond simply been a way of showing him the futility of humanity's endless aggression? "Why?" Jack managed to croak, his voice hoarse, his thoughts still clouded. "Why show me this? Why make me part of this?" The leader regarded him silently for a moment, her expression inscrutable. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, but filled with the weight of experience. "Because, human, you have seen the truth. You have felt our history. You have touched the very core of what we have endured. And it is not simply a punishment, it is a path to understanding. You now know the cost of your war, the bloodshed that has spilled on both sides, the lives that have been lost in the name of conquest. You know that it is not just our people who suffer. It is the entire galaxy that bears the consequences of these endless cycles of violence." Her words hit Jack harder than any explosion he had ever experienced. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. He had felt it, yes, the pain, the weight of the Zal's struggles, but was it truly his place to understand it, to take on their burden? He was a soldier. He had been trained to fight, to win, to protect his people at any cost. But now, in the wake of this ritual, he was faced with something far more profound. The war was no longer black and white. It was not just humanity versus the Zal. It was something much bigger, something more complex, more heartbreaking. The leader took another step toward him, her gaze unwavering. "You are no longer just a soldier of your people, Jack Talbot," she said, her voice steady. "You are part of something greater now. You are part of our story. And through the bond we share, you will carry our legacy with you. You will fight with us, for us, against the forces that seek to destroy everything we have fought for." Jack felt a sudden shift in the air. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. The other women, who had remained silent observers up until now, stepped forward in unison, their movements deliberate. Their eyes locked onto Jack with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. It was clear that this bond, this connection, was not just a fleeting moment. It was a transformation. His world had shifted irrevocably, and now, as the weight of their presence grew heavier around him, Jack realized that he was no longer just a participant in a ritual. He was now a part of something far larger, something that would alter the course of his life and his future. "Stand with us, human," the leader said, her voice now a command, her presence an undeniable force. "Stand with us, and together, we will shape the future. Together, we will end the war. Together, we will break the cycle." Jack's heart thudded in his chest as her words reverberated within him. He had seen the horrors of war, the destruction, the suffering, the death. He had witnessed firsthand the cost of aggression, the toll it took on all those involved. But he had never before felt the weight of it like this, as if the pain of an entire species had been laid bare in his soul. The bond was real, more real than anything he had ever experienced. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of a shared history, a shared struggle. And that meant that everything had changed. The path ahead was no longer about fighting for his own people. It was about fighting for a future where this cycle of violence could end. "I will fight," Jack said, his voice steady, his mind clear now. "I will stand with you. But how do we stop it? How do we end this endless war?" The leader's gaze softened just slightly, though the resolve in her eyes remained unyielding. "The answer lies not in battle, but in understanding. The war has lasted so long because both sides have refused to see the humanity in each other. It has become a war of pride, of honor, of survival. But we, those who have endured this pain, will show the galaxy that there is another way. We will show them that peace is possible." Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just about stopping a war. It was about changing the very nature of conflict. It was about showing the galaxy a different path, one that could bring an end to the destruction. And in that moment, Jack knew that he had a part to play in this, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. As the women circled him, their presence now a constant force, Jack felt the bond deepen. It was no longer just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. He was part of them, and they were part of him. Together, they would face the future, and together, they would bring about change. The leader's eyes met his once more, and with a single, silent nod, the next phase of the trial had begun. It was no longer about survival. It was about redemption. It was about the galaxy's future, and in that moment, Jack realized that the war had never been the real battle. The true fight was for understanding. And that was a fight worth winning. Epilogue, a new dawn. The days following the trial passed in a blur, each moment spent learning, adapting, and understanding the depth of what had happened. Jack had been transformed not in the way a soldier changes after a battle, not in the way one sheds blood for the cause. No, this was different. It was more profound. It was the understanding of a history, a people's grief and their hope for the future. The women who had bonded with Jack in the trial were not just his allies. They were his teachers. They showed him the intricacies of their culture, the delicate balance between survival and honor, the long history of war that had shaped their species into what they were today. Each of them had lived through loss, had experienced the destruction of their homes, the betrayal of their allies, and yet, they carried on. They fought not just for survival, but for something more, something that transcended the endless battles. They fought for peace, for understanding, and for the future of all sentient beings. Jack's role in this new struggle was clearer now. He was not just a soldier, not just an outsider who had stumbled into their world. He was a bridge, a symbol of the possibility for change. He had learned from the trial of bonding that true peace could not be achieved through force alone. It had to be nurtured, understood, and fought for on every level, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The war between humanity and the Zal had been fought with pride and rage for too long. But Jack's survival in the trial, his connection with the Zal women, had shown him that there was more at stake than just victory or defeat. There was the chance for redemption. There was a path forward. The Zal leader, who had once been the stern and commanding figure of judgment, now walked beside him as an equal. She shared with Jack the dream of a galaxy where species could understand each other, where they could see past their differences and recognize their shared humanity. "The war will not end with a battle," she had said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength. "It will end when we choose to lay down our weapons, not because we are defeated, but because we have learned to see the other as ourselves." As the Zal began their efforts to reach out to other species, humanity, included Jack, stood at the forefront of that movement. He used his position as a soldier, a representative of Earth, to break down the walls between them. He was no longer an enemy, no longer just a symbol of human aggression. He was a symbol of change, of hope, and he carried with him the lessons he had learned from the trial of bonding. But the path was not easy. Not everyone was ready for change. The war-hardened generals of humanity, the leaders who had only known conflict, saw Jack's new alliance with the Zal as a betrayal. And the Zal, though open to peace, were still wary of the humans who had brought war to their doorstep. But Jack never faltered. He fought for what he believed in, not with weapons, but with the lessons of the trial and the understanding it had given him. Years passed, and slowly, the tides began to turn. The war, which had seemed endless and inevitable, finally started to lose its power. People began to listen. The Zal reached out to the human factions, and Jack, a soldier who had once been a tool of war, became a diplomat, a voice of reason in the face of chaos. In the end, the battle was not won by force. It was won by the bond that Jack had formed with the Zal. It was a bond that transcended species, a bond of shared suffering, of shared survival. The trial of bonding had changed everything, and Jack's survival had become the catalyst for a new future. The day the peace accords were signed, the moment the first handshake between the Zal and human representatives took place, Jack stood quietly in the background. He didn't need the recognition. He didn't need the accolades. All that mattered was the future. A future where war was not inevitable, where understanding could replace hatred, where the legacy of the past could be used as a foundation for a better tomorrow. As Jack looked at the faces around him, human, Zal, and others who had once been enemies, he knew that the bond he had shared with the Zal women had been the beginning of something far greater than himself. It had been a connection, a turning point that had forever altered the course of his life and, in turn, the course of history. And in that moment, Jack finally understood. The greatest battles aren't fought with weapons. They are fought with understanding, with the willingness to see the world through another's eyes, to feel their pain, their hopes, and their dreams. The trial of bonding had not just been a punishment. It had been a gift. It had shown him that true peace wasn't something that could be imposed, was something that had to be earned, through compassion, through connection, and through the shared hope that the future could be different from the past. As he walked away from the peace table, Jack felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The war was over. The future had begun. And it had started with the bond that had united them all.